If you want to cover quite a long distance, take quite a lot of kit, have quite a lot of fun, all in comfort, I'm not sure you've ever had so many options. This, the Mercedes-AMG GT 4-door, is the latest.
So in the UK we get two variants of AMG's new 4-door coupe. Lesser, more vanilla flavours are available abroad, but we get the V8 powered 63 versions. The standard one making about 550 horsepower, and then there's the S, which is what this is, which makes a full fat 630 brake horsepower and costs around £135,000. But we don't just want to test the GT 4-door on its own, so we have brought along its fiercest rival, the Porsche Panamera. Now the Panamera range is a bit bigger, you can have stuff from there through to here. As with the AMG, we've gone for the top spec version, which means we've got the Panamera Turbo SE Hybrid. So it has the turbo's 550 horsepower V8, augmented by an electric motor of 130-ish horsepower, which gives it a grand total of 680 PS, 671 brake horsepower. That's more, obviously, than the AMG, but it weighs quite a lot more too, because the battery and the electric motor add 300 kilos to the Panamera's weight too. So in summary, we've got the top spec version of both cars. They have similar power to weight ratios. They have similar costs at £135,000, £140,000 basic, £160,000, £170,000 by the time they've got all the options that these have got on. So let's see which one of them is the ultimate last word in sportiness, luxury, roominess, spaciousness, GT-ness, everything that these cars are supposed to do, which is everything. So this is the Panamera on the road / track that looks exactly like a road and behaves like one too, fundamentally and importantly. I'm in e-power mode. You don't want to be in that. You want to be in sport, because it's slightly more representative, or hybrid or sport, more representative of what form the Panamera will be driven in most of the time, because I get the impression that this is the kind of plug-in hybrid vehicle that pure EV drivers have a slight problem with when they see it parked up and plugged in all day long. Because it's got a pretty short range. It's 132 brake horsepower electric motor, and it doesn't have the sort of range that you would do all of your driving in, even though the official CO2 emissions figure is 66 grams per kilometre or thereabouts, and the official MPG figure is quite lengthy. I think most Panamera Turbo SE hybrids, most plug-in hybrid Panameras probably get driven with the 4-litre twin-turbocharged V8 assisting things more often than you would think.
And it is a powerful engine. With 550 horsepower, it sits at the front and drives all four wheels through an 8-speed dual-clutch gearbox with a limited slip differential at the rear. There are air springs too, and the architecture that sits beneath the Panamera is the same platform that is the base for the Bentley Continental GT. It's a kind of mixed metal composite, mostly of steel but using lots of aluminium, such as for the body panels, to try and keep the weight down. But this is still a heavy car, which keeps it from being our favourite Panamera. You can make the body in white as light as you like, but by the time you put the hardware in, including a 15 kilowatt hour battery, you end up with a car that we've put on our scales at 2,300 kilograms.
And even if you are Porsche, who do amazing things with cars, really amazing things, the agility on this, the steering's really nice, you can feel it, a little bit of roll, and then the steering weights up really nicely, and it's a good car to drive, but you can't overcome those kinds of physics. It is a pleasantly riding car. I've got one firmness on me damper there. Right, so now I've got the dampers as soft as they go. The ride is fine, body control is still well contained, it's responsive, but it still weighs 2.3 tons, and that is an issue. And of course, if you're making a fast Porsche and your car weighs 2.3 tons, you have to give it quite a lot of power. So combined together, 550-ish PS engine at the front, 132-ish brake horsepower motor. Anyway, the total is 680 PS. What's that? 671 horsepower, which is ludicrous supercar levels of power, absolutely supercar levels of power. So that's fifth gear. Let's have fifth gear at 2,000 RPM at 42 miles an hour and see. The pickup is instant, absolutely instant. That's 4,000 revs, 80 miles an hour already, 597, 100 miles an hour, 110, 115, 120, 30, and that's the limiter in fourth at 130. That's unbelievably ridiculous. On the Autobahn, this thing must be an absolute scream. I would think probably the fastest way to go from Hamburg to Stuttgart is in one of these. That's, wow, it just picks up, takes off. And it's so linear, because although the engine will be reasonably well boosted, the fact that the electric motor fills that torque gap means that it just gets up and it goes. And gear shifts are quick, and the whole thing is responsive, and it's an eye-wateringly rapid car. You can feel the weight, but there's no waiting for it. It's not like you wait for it to take a run up or anything. It just, the acceleration is instant and just keeps going and going and going, and that's quite nice, isn't it, really? I mean, I know it's slightly unnecessary and everything else, but it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. I mean, for a comfortable car that's great at cruising, it's a pretty cool place to be, pretty special place to be. It would be better, perhaps, if it was a little bit lighter, but as well as all of the hardware, it's also got quite a lot of kit inside it. Anyway, so let's stop and I'll talk you through all the stuff it's got inside, because there's sufficient here that I don't want to do it while we're moving, especially not at the kind of speeds it is capable of moving at, because that's off the scale ludicrous. This then is the interior of the Panamera, and there are things it gets very right indeed. The driving position is superb. I get a big round steering wheel, and there is a big rev counter front row centre in the middle of an otherwise digital dash display. So the driving environment from that point of view is spot on. Now, all of that is augmented by a series of haptic sort of feedback buttons down here, and also a touch screen, which is slightly less successful, because to actually touch things on the screen, the navigation of it is not totally straightforward all the time. I mean, you do get used to it, and some of the buttons are in, you know, like the little back button is in a tiny place here. There is a small knob which scrolls through some things, but it just feels like it would be more sensible if there were a larger dial somewhere to control things that were where you used them, just because otherwise you have to take your eyes off the road, sometimes for quite a distressingly long time. That said, things like the drive modes, because let's face it, Porsche is a sports car company, so it gets these things right. So to scroll through from e-power mode through hybrid mode into sport and sport plus is much more straightforward. And, you know, the two most prominent buttons on the entire dash control the dampers and the ESC off mode. So it's a slight mix of great and not great. The great thing is the driving controls are all exactly where you want them, really easy to get to. What I suspect in a car of this kind, though, the things that you would end up using more often, some of the functionality and communications and things like that, that is a bit less successful. But let's have a look at what it's like in the back. So welcome to the back, where I've got to confess I am quite comfortable, actually. This driving seat is set up for my driving position. I'm around 5'10", so an adult behind another adult is pretty easy. Because of the size of the centre console, you only get 2 rear seats, but that does mean that they are sort of individual and sculpted chairs, very comfortable indeed. There is a set of climate control functions for rear seat passengers as well, which is cool, and you get a touch screen here, which is obviously fine to use because you don't have to be looking at the road all the time, and that also controls, if you specify it, as somebody has here, the full rear seat entertainment option, though I imagine with tablets and so on, that is an option less specified than it used to be. It is quite a nice environment. The nice thing is it's pretty spacious back here. And so to the inside of the AMG on the move. Is there a little bit more road noise? There may be, I think, but it's marginal. This car is running winter tyres because it's March, and in the UK that means it could be anything from the quite pleasant 13.5 degrees that it is today, or it could be snowing. So that covers everything. But they are, so I might get a little bit more steering imprecision and perhaps a bit more tyre roar than usual, but I think pretty marginal. So what do we have? Well, unlike AMG's other standalone vehicle, the GT, and before that the SLS, which were made on a bespoke aluminium architecture, the GT 4-door, despite having the same name as the GT in the GT part of it, isn't just a GT with 4 doors, it's actually based on Mercedes' large car E-Class platform. Now, the significance of that is that it is a mostly steel monocoque, for one, rather than a bespoke aluminium shell. And if you've ever seen in the back of Aston Martin's 4-door Rapide, aluminium's great at saving weight, but it does sometimes occupy more space for the same amount of rigidity. So if you get in the back of an Aston Rapide, you go, blimey, it's quite cramped in here. And as we'll see in a minute, that isn't necessarily the case in here.
The other significant difference between the GT sports car and this GT 4-door is that although the engine is at the front of both, in the GT it drives a transaxle, so the gearbox is at the rear, and that evens out the weight distribution, whereas on this architecture, the weight is further forward. That said, there's less mass than there is in the Panamera. We've put a GT 4-door on the scales at around 2.1 tonnes. So although the AMG gives 50 horsepower away to the Panamera Turbo S e-hybrid, the accelerative force is not that far away.
Now, in the Panamera, you just knock things over into manual. You can't do that here. I have to either set it up on here for my little shortcut button, which I have. And let's go down to 40 miles an hour in 4th gear. Slightly shorter geared. I've got 2,500 revs on rather than 2,000 in the Panamera. There's the lag. You hear the turbos whistle, and it takes a while to spool up. Then it runs into its soft lip at only 110 rather than 120, 7,000 RPM. But similarly, absurdly rapid. So that's 4,000 revs on. So there's a bit more lag because there isn't an electric motor to fill the torque gap. And this engine at 630 horsepower, Tobias Moers, the boss of AMG, says that this 4-litre V8 is kind of at the limit of its power at sort of 630. I mean, you wouldn't want any more than that, would you? Really? 600, 630? What does it matter? It's loads. You know, to get more power from an AMG, they'll have to do something other than this engine. You suspect electrification is coming. That may or may not come with downsizing. AMG's a big fan of a V8, so am I, who isn't? So that's quite cool. So I think a V8 will always stay in its range. Long may it be so. Because the noise, I've just turned up the exhaust there. The noise just feels slightly more artificial than in the GT to me, but still very much a V8. And just as we come over some of those crests there, this car's still 4-wheel drive. You just feel the body rise and settle, and it feels that bit more alert, that bit more agile than the Panamera, which is not surprising given how much weight it's giving away to the Panamera. There's a bit of body roll, the steering takes on some reassuring weight. The ride is fine. I was in sports suspension then. The ride feels pretty good to me, actually. I think this is the nicer car to drive. It makes the nicer noise. It goes just as hard. Obviously, the CO2 figure is quite a lot higher because it doesn't pretend that it's powered by electric motor most of the time. And it makes that wonderful noise. But overall, this feels to me like the more agile, the more engaging. I mean, I suspect if you put a stopwatch on them, the Panamera may be quicker in a straight line and around a racetrack, but who cares? I mean, when is a 630 horsepower, 5 metre long car ever going to be not enough? It just isn't. It feels that bit more characterful. The interior is a bit more flamboyant. To me, it's a more involving, emotional is the wrong word, but the first word that comes to mind. It's the more interesting driving experience. It's, I think, a better looking car for my eyes. It's the one I'd rather spend, I think, a bit more time in. It feels to me like this car would have, unless you particularly must have, because of where you live, the ability to go on electric power alone. This to me feels like the better car. Anyway, I need to talk you through some of the interior, so we'll do that and see what it's like in the back, and then continue from there. But so far, I'm liking this quite a lot. Okay, go from 2,000 RPM. And so to the AMG. Now, the driving position is also very good, widely adjustable, but there's probably a bit less focus to it than there is in the Panamera. The wheel is not round for a start, and there is a lot more going on. It's a far more flamboyant interior. In many ways, I like that. I love these vents. I think they really look absolutely terrific. They look like some turbine or wheel or something very cool. And while the sort of focus from a driver's perspective of the driving environment is perhaps not where the Porsche is, I get a large panel here to control the main screen, and it's more easy to navigate, it's more straightforward, and because this panel is always where it is, I don't have to take my eyes off the road quite so much. And that's supplemented by the fact that it gets this brilliant little dial left and also one for the right, which controls the instrument binnacle. It's just an easier system to navigate, it's an easier system to live with. Now, when it comes to driving controls, it's pretty good too, actually. All of the major functions are down here on these sort of, 4 buttons each side, reminiscent of a V8, I am told. So I can put the spoiler up and down, make the exhaust change and things like that. And then there are little shortcut buttons on the steering wheel. So to scroll through driving modes, I can just do that on the left or select an individual mode. And then these 2 buttons down here can change their functions. So if you want to decide how much of a div you look with the wing up and down, or how loud your exhaust is, you can do that. Or you can change it to have manual mode and start, stop, on and off and stuff like that. Really clever, really cool. Let's see what it's like in the back. And so to the back. Now, you may notice that it doesn't have quite the same level of touchscreen luxury as you get in the Panamera, but you can have that as an option. It just hasn't been ticked on this particular car. Otherwise, the window line is quite high. Maybe I can't get my feet quite so far under the seat in front, but I've got a very comfortable rear seat. There's a bit more spaciousness because the center console is lower, and I've got loads of knee room and enough headroom. Both of these cars are not the last word in spaciousness and luxury like a 7 Series or an S-Class, but they're not going to be, are they? For the kind of cars they are, they're absolutely spot on.
Ultimately then, it's the GT 4-door which seems more like a super saloon coupe ought to be. As a do-everything car that can be plugged in for short commutes but used over longer distances, the Panamera has its appeal. But the lighter, more rewarding, better sounding and all-round more engaging car is the one made by AMG. Now, if you like this twin test, don't forget we're here all the time with news, reviews, drag races, features, all kinds of things. So don't forget to up thumb, subscribe, and if you turn on notifications, you won't miss a thing.